Deploying Blazor is really easy, but instead of me just showing you a few magic steps, we're going to break down the deployment process and understand each piece well. That way, you're prepared to use each step in the real world with a real project. This will be a small series of videos. This video will cover setting up an Azure Web App in the portal, including understanding the pricing and configuration options. We'll also create a GitHub repository that will add a small Blazor application too. This will set us up for our next steps, including automating our deployment with GitHub Actions, updating our connection strings, and adding a custom domain name to our site. At the end of the day, you'll have a fully deployed Blazor application in an Azure Web App with a custom domain name with connection strings that are pulling right from Azure. Now, before we dive in, I want to share a few things with you. First, if you're interested in improving your C# skills, be sure to subscribe to this channel. With over 500 C# videos and counting, it's the perfect place to learn and grow your skills. Second, if you're looking for free C# resources, head over to www.imtimcorey.com and check out the resources tab. You'll find my podcast, C# projects page, and much more there. And third, if you're ready for a deeper dive into a specific C# topics, I have a variety of courses that can help. Not only will you receive a world-class education, but you'll also help fund my free content so that everyone can have a great education in C#, not just those who can afford it. So let's jump right in, but instead of to Visual Studio today, we're going to jump into GitHub first. We're going to start here. We're going to build out our sample project and then move over to Azure and build out a web app. So let's start with a new repository, and let's call this Blazor deploy. And this is not going to be public. I'm not going to publish this repo. I will give you a source code for you can download the link description, but I'm going to delete this repository. That's why I'm not going to make it public. I don't need to have it clogging up our repositories. So this is just a sample deployment. There we go. Deployment site. How about that? And we'll make it private. Add a README, and we are going to add a gitignore for Visual Studio. And whether you use Visual Studio or VS Code or even JetBrains Writer, this is the template to add for a C# project, is the Visual Studio gitignore file. We're going to leave the license alone at none and create the repository. So now we have our repository. It's simple. It's easy. We have just two files, gitignore and README. So I'm going to go to code and say I'm going to copy the HTTPS version. And then we're done for now on this site. So let's go ahead and I'll move this off to the side just so we have it in case we need it later. I'm going to bring over a PowerShell window. In the C demos folder, I'm going to say git clone, and I will paste in that URL and hit enter. It's going to clone that URL, and it's going to clone it into the CD Blazor deploy folder. So now if you look here, there's nothing in here except for the gitignore and the README, which is great. We can say, though, let's clear the screen, say .NET new SLN. What this will do is it will create a new solution in this folder, which is what we want because then we can just double click it, open it, and start using Visual Studio. So let's just do that. It's gonna, if I don't give it a name, notice it's trying to prompt me to say, hey, do you want a name for this? We're not gonna add that name. We're just gonna say .NET new SLN. It creates a new solution for us. And if we look in the folder, we have Blazor deploy, and now we have our README, our gitignore, and our Blazor deploy solution. Let's open that up. And now in here, we've got our solution. Notice our git changes. It says, hey, there's a solution here. But let's go ahead and right click and say add new project, and we'll create a Blazor server application. Let's call this simple Blazor app. Hit next, .NET 7, HTTPS, and we hit create. And now that this is done, we have a simple Blazor application that should be up and running. Let's go ahead and launch this just to make sure it is working. We're going to make a couple of tweaks to this just so we have something a little more customized to us. But let's look, and sure enough, we have our hello world, we have our counter, and that works. We have our fetch data, and every time we come back to the page, it changes the data that's been fetched, which is exactly right. So let's go over here and actually let's come down here and, well, let's just resize it manually. I don't have the zone snapped here, so I'm just going to do it manually. But I want to bring this page over here just so you can see that, in fact, it does automatically update. So let's go to the home page, and then let's come over here to pages and go to index. And let's change some things. Let's get rid of the survey prompt first, and we'll hit save. And notice over here that when I come back to this page and look at it, the survey prompt goes away because that's the hot reload for Blazor. And we're going to change this to say, hello, YouTube. And let's get rid of the welcome to our new app. We're going to put something else there instead. So there we go, hello, YouTube. What we're going to put here is I want to put a paragraph with a class equal to h4. And in here, I'm going to say default connection string. And I'm going to put a value here, which I don't have yet. So let's create a value for that. Code, we're going to say private string default connection. And let's initialize this to a value of empty string. And then we're going to say protected, override, and we'll say on initialized. We'll get rid of the base.initialized. And instead, we're going to say that we have to inject something too. We have to say inject. This is dependency injection. We're going to say configuration. We'll call this config. And down here, we'll say default connection equals config dot get connection string. And we'll say that the default connection string. Let's unpin this so you can see the whole thing here. Now, if we do this like so, we get this green squiggly saying, hey, there's a possible null reference assignment. That's because if there's no connection string, like there's not right now, this will return a null value. But because we have not marked this as nullable, it's giving us a warning saying, hey, you might be getting a null value when you did not expect to get a null value. So that's true. We don't expect to get a null value. Therefore, we're going to do the null coalescing operator and say unknown. That way, if it is a null value, we'll put unknown in the connection string instead. That way, we know that we couldn't find it. And in fact, if we save this, we have to rebuild and continue. Let's let that run for a minute. Wait for it to start. And there we go. It's not saying any connection string yet. That's because we haven't actually put it on the page. Let's do that by saying at default connection. Save that. Come back over here. It says unknown because we have not yet assigned a value. This is where that null coalescing operator is helpful. This is where the null checks are really helpful because if this was not doing null checks, then I wouldn't have remembered that this could be null and we had a null value here. So let's go over now to our connection string, our app settings.json, put a comma here and say connection strings. And we're going to say default. And we'll say this is from app settings.json. So this is not a real connection string. This is just to show off the fact that we have a connection string coming from somewhere. Now, it does not actually track the changes from app settings.json with a hot reload. But now, default connection string this is from app settings.json. So it's actually pulling our connection string. Now, why do I want to pull a connection string? Because I want to show off the fact that when we deploy to Azure, that we'll be able to change this connection string automatically without having to do anything, even in our build process. So we can still use the local connection string for our local SQL server or whatever, but then when it goes to the server, it can change it to the production version of the connection string. So Again, we're not going to connect to SQL Server. That's a little bit outside the scope of this video or a series of videos. But what we can do is look at those connection strings and see how they can change as we deploy to a production environment. So that's all it is for our site. We have a working site. It pulls the app setting.json connection string. It says, hello, YouTube. The counter still works. The fetch data page still works. Okay, so that's what we have on the Blazor side. But how do we deploy this? Now, we could right-click on the project and say Publish, and then go through the steps of targeting Azure and so on. We're not going to do that. And the reason why is because that works great for a sample project or for a quick little thing you want to do. And you can even save those now into a repeatable process. But we're going to go over to Azure and set up a GitHub action so that it's an automated process that's continuous integration deployment. It will automatically deploy right to our Azure website when we push to a certain branch. In this case, we're just going to work on main branch. We're not going to worry about different branches. We can probably do that in the future if that's of interest. If it is, leave a comment down in the description or in the comments on YouTube, and we'll think about doing that in the future. Okay, so that's our site. Now let's go over to Azure. In Azure, I have this blank dashboard with nothing in it. So let's go ahead and create a resource. We're going to create a web app. So hit create. Now, an Azure web app is an interesting thing, and it's misunderstood quite a bit because they are much more expensive than just, say, hosting on a cheap hosting platform. And you know what? For some instances, that might be the best solution, just host on a cheap platform. However, there's also a free version if you want to go that direction with Azure. So you can actually get even cheaper. But let's start and go through this, and we'll talk about the pricing because the pricing is not for a website. The pricing is for a web server where you can then put multiple websites. So we're going to pay once for a server and then have quite a few websites if we wanted to on that server, just to be clear here. Okay, let's start with the resource group. You want to create a new resource group because resource group names are free, but what they do is they allow you to connect all the resources together. So when you're done testing, you can delete the resource group and delete all the things underneath it, even things that were created automatically. So we're going to call this our Blazor deploy group. How about that? Just a descriptive name. This name is unique to your instance of Azure, so you can create whatever you want, and it won't step on the toes of somebody else that created. So Blazor deploy group is fine. If you're going to create demo stuff, I'd encourage you to put like demo in the name or some kind of way to know I can delete this. It's okay because it's just a demo. So again, resource groups are free. I would encourage you to use them whenever you're creating something that you want to bundle with other things. So if you're creating multiple things that all work together, create one resource group for it so you know, hey, these things are connected. Okay. Resource group name, now a web app name. This is unique across all of Azure. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated to get a name that works for you. So if we have said Blazor deploy, that actually works. I guess no one has chosen Blazor-deploy for a domain name or for a web app name. So we're going to say we're going to use code to publish. We're going to choose .NET 7, which is the standard term support. We're going to choose Linux hosting, not Windows hosting. Linux hosting is cheaper, and for .NET Core or .NET 7, this is more of what it's designed to do is Linux. So unless you have a specific need for Windows, go to Linux. It's cheaper, it's easier, it's faster, it's so many more things. Just do Linux. Now, this is where we're setting up our server or app service plan. So we're going to choose, I'm in the Central US, so let's choose Central US. And of course, there is no plans currently for me. And again, the app service plan is like a web server. It's going to host our website. So this right here, this Blazor deploy, is our web site. This is a web server that we're building now because we don't already have one. If we had one, we could just choose it from a list. We're going to say create new. Let's give it a name. We're going to call it the Blazor deploy. How about web server? How about that? Okay. And we're going to call this the Blazor deploy app, just to be clear. So now we have our Blazor deploy web server, which by default, they chose Premium V3, which is expensive. If you do a drop down here, you'll notice that it is $124 a month. Now, this is a production level plan. But if you want a basic, it's $13 a month. And again, remember, this is for a web server that can host multiple websites. So when you have a second Blazor server to deploy, you can deploy it to the same web server for free. It's no additional cost. So this $13 a month will cover one app, like we're deploying up here, but we can deploy a second app to it, a third app, and a fourth app, and a fifth app, and it's still just $13 a month total, not per app. So, but to be clear, we're sharing resources. So a cheap plan with not a lot of memory and CPU, it's not going to do great if you have high traffic sites, multiple on that one plan. But you can upgrade the server as you go and say, hey, you know what, we're going to use more resources. We can bump it up to the next plan. These are just the suggested plans. You can go to other Explore pricing plans and look at more of them and choose one that's more specific to you. We're just going to choose the basic B1. Actually, you know what? We're going to choose pricing plans. I do want you to see these things because there are, let's go to feature view. So there are a number of things that these can do. For example, staging slots. This is a big one that people often miss. And that is, notice down here it says not available for free and basic. And then the dev or test sites have not available for our staging slots. This is important if you want to do a real production site. We're going to do that with this one because it's important, I think, to have these staging slots. Because what happens is you can deploy your branch and say, hey, this is a dev branch, and it will have the same type of resources and the same abilities as your production server for free on a different URL. And that way you can test things out, make sure they work. And then when you're ready, you can do what's called a slot swap. And it will switch the two, the dev server and the production server, and make sure that you're up and running and there's no disruption to your clients. But that doesn't come for free. Notice that the hosting plan here is $80 a month. Now, of course, this is my region, so it might be different in your region, but $80 a month, yeah, that's much more expensive. But again, a lot more resources. If you go back up here to hardware view, we'll notice that we've got 4 gigabytes of memory, we've got 250 gigabytes of remote storage, and we have scale of up to 30 instances with a guaranteed uptime. So there is things to think through when you're looking at these beyond just, oh, it's expensive or it's cheap. You do get what you pay for. But down here, notice 70 US, 69 really, for standard S1. That is 1.75 gigabytes of RAM. That's 50 gigabytes of hard drive. That's 10 slots, which is plenty. And it's one virtual CPU. So this right here is what I host my suggestion site on. So suggestions.imtimcorey.com, that's what it's hosted on. It costs me $70 a month. Now, that's not the only site that's hosted there. I've got a number of other sites that are also hosted there, including some test sites and some sites for myself, as well as some other public-facing sites. So it's that $70 US is actually divided amongst a number of sites. And so I actually have a pretty cheap hosting plan, even though it costs me more than what a cheap host would. So it's not, the $8 a month or whatever a cheap web host might cost me, but I get a lot more features and I get a lot more sites and abilities. Plus I have the scalability of Azure. And this is where, again, as a small business, this is something that's really important because there are times when I need to scale up. I've had to scale up because I have a lot of traffic hitting my site all at once. Well, with Azure, I can do that automatically or manually. And this allows me to have that flexibility that I wouldn't on a normal web host. So it's up to you which one you choose. For us, what we're going to choose the Premium V3, which is $80 US a month. Again, that's per month, but your build, I believe it's per hour or maybe per minute. And so what you can do is if you test this out, but you only say, let's use 1 day's worth of time, and then you delete the resource group. Well, divide 80 by 30, that's, 1 month. And so it's going to cost you a couple of dollars, $3 to test it out for a day. So just know you're not, committing to that full amount, but be careful. Whatever you select, make sure that you can afford. But also notice up here is the free F1 tier. If you choose this, you get 60 minutes per day of a CPU. You might say, Tim, does that mean the website will only run for 60 minutes? No, it doesn't. The website will actually run pretty much all day. But if you have lots of traffic on it where it's doing computational work. So normally a website is just, hey, here's the site. But if you have to do work like building out the site, like you would with a Blazor site to start it up, that's a little bit of computational work. And usually that's, a second or two. So it's not a lot of computational work. But if you do more than 60 minutes of that computational work per day, well, it's going to freeze you out until the next day. But this is free for life. You can put up to 10 websites on this free F1 plan. So you can have 10 websites hosted for free on Azure with no strings attached. It's free for life. But again, if you're doing tons of processing, more than 60 minutes of processing a day, they'll shut down until the next day. This is just for demo purposes, trying things out, seeing if you like it, and seeing how Azure works without spending a lot of money. So for us, we're going to choose the Premium V3 for $80 US a month. We're going to hit select. Okay, so that's the pricing tier I chose. That's the name. Just verify everything is the same way it was before. And we're not going to choose zone redundancy. So let's hit deployment next. And we could, in this step, set up our GitHub action. We're not going to do that in this step. We're going to do it in a separate step. But if you want to do it all in one step, you can say enable, and then you could choose your organization. You could choose your repository and your branch, and it would set up for you a GitHub action automatically. We're going to do it separately, but just know that that's there. Leave networking as is. Monitoring, I'm going to turn off application insights. We're not going to focus on that in this mini series. Let's go to review and create. And this is going to create for us our web application. Okay, so we're going to hit create. Now it does not know about our source code. So when it's deploying a website, but the website is just going to be a standard website ready for our source code, but it's not going to have any results in it or any type of source code in it other than a generic landing page. So we're going to connect that in the next step. But let's finish up with this first. All right, our deployment is successful, so we can go to resource, and we can actually pin this to the to our dashboard if we want. But we'll leave it here for now. Let's go look at the website. Let's go to default domain. Notice it says blazor-deploy-app.azurewebsites.net. We click on it, and it's going to take us to our website, which takes a little bit to start up the first time because it's got to, get all the things in line and spool up the virtual machine and all the rest. So this is going to be the foundation on which we build. This is where we're going to deploy our web application. But First, we want to make sure it's working, make sure it's running, and we'll take a peek at the other configuration too. So for right now, we're deploying code to it's a .NET Core 7 runtime. There's the site, by the way. So it's working. It's just waiting for your content. So it is running. It's just a blank slate right now. All right. So we have our operating system in Linux, and if you go to configuration here, we'll see that we can access the application settings, connection strings, general settings, for example, major version, minor version of .NET, and then turn on or turn off the various parts. For example, this is something that I will turn on, and that is always on. You will not be able to turn this on the cheap plans. But on the production plans, you can turn on always on. And what it does, it prevents your app from being idled out due to inactivity. So as a cost-saving mechanism, it will turn your site off, essentially, or pause it when no one's hitting it. And then the first person to hit it is going to have a little bit of extra time going to your site because it's been turned off to save resources. But if you say always on, then it's going to keep that site spooled up and running in the background and use a little bit of resources to do that. But that way, when a person comes to your site, it'll be much more responsive. So, and we will hit save. So it's got to restart our website in order to allow this, but that's what we have set up for our Azure website. So now we have our Azure Web App, which is built upon let's go back to our dashboard here and go to, let's go to resource groups, and we'll choose the Blazor deploy group. And notice in here we have a Blazor deploy app, which is an app service, think of that like a website. And then we have our Blazor deploy web server, which is like our web server or app service plan. This is the thing, the Blazor web server, that is what's going to host all of our web apps. We can have multiple if we want. But if you go to our app, by the way, let's pin this to the dashboard so we have it. So pin it to samples. And then here what we can do is we can look at this idea of scale up and scale out. So scale up is if we want to make our plan bigger. So right now we're on Premium V3, POV3, or P0 V3. And that's 80 US a month. But if we say, you know what, we're getting slammed, we need to really up this and get, more memory. And so you could say Premium V3, P2 V3. Well, that gives you 16 gigabytes of RAM. It gets you 4 virtual CPUs, and it costs $248 a month. If we just select that, we hit select, it will apply it and will scale up our site, and our site will immediately get faster. But that is if you want to make a bigger server. But if you also want, you can scale out. And what this allows you to do is say, hey, we want to be able to have 20 instances of our site. And we'll create 20 copies of your site. And then it will allow users to go to different ones based upon the load. You can also say custom auto scale. So you can set up an auto scale based upon a certain metric. So for example, maximum could be 10 and the default is 1. And we can set up a metric, create a rule to say, hey, when a CPU is above 70%, then create a second one of these and a third one and so on. Now, this will cost you more money as you scale up. We're going to discard this. But that's because it's making copies of it. But the benefit here is that it will allow you to make your site more resilient in the case where you're getting hit with a lot of traffic. It can scale up until it's no longer needed and then scale back down. That will allow you to, handle the load properly, but at the same time, only pay for the resources you're using. So if you use those resources for a day, you'll be spending a few dollars for that additional cost, those additional servers, and then it goes back away and you don't have to spend them anymore. Or you can manually say, hey, let's scale it up for, the next 5 days and then manually scale it back down. We know we're going to have additional need. This is the power and flexibility of the cloud. is you can scale up and down as necessary. If you find that you're never using these resources, if you're looking at this and saying, hey, I'm not using any of the power that I have, you can actually scale down and pay less. So that also is another benefit. Again, there's those deployment slots should we decide we want to add more slots for different purposes. We'll get into that later. So we have our Azure site, and we also have our source code, and we have our GitHub repository. Let's come over here and refresh. We have not yet pushed our changes, so let's do that. Let's let's make sure you save everything. Initial code commit, and we'll commit all in sync. Wait for it to be pushed. Okay, and now what we're going to do is just refresh this and see that yes, we have our solution. We have our project. We have all of our source code in here. So that's all we need right now. Now note that in appsettings.json, we do have this coming in, this default connection. In a real application, I would not put a real connection string here. I wouldn't even put a demo connection string there. What I'd do instead is I'd put it in secrets.json and then override this. I did not do that here because I wanted to make sure you had this code, but just note that do not put any type of real connection string in a file that gets committed to your source control. So I have a video on secrets.json. You should check it out. Also, if you want to know more about Azure and the stuff we've been doing with Azure, then check out my Azure course. I have a whole course on Azure and how to save money with it, how to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. We do a lot of cool stuff. And at the end of the day, I think we spend about $5 of actual money on our demos, even if we didn't get the free money. They give us free money to begin with, to play around with, to try out for 30 days. I actually had to do that. But even if you didn't do that, we would have spent like $5 to test out even some really big, cool things. So you can do Azure on the real cheap, and actually how to get the most out of your resources, get stuff for free, how to take advantage of that free stuff, how to make sure you monitor your costs and don't have cost overruns and so many other things. But this mini series is going to give you a good idea of how to publish Blazor, in this case, Blazor Server, but it would work with Blazor WebAssembly as well, Blazor Server to Azure Web App, and make sure we have continuous deployment with GitHub Actions and make sure our connection strings are updating and so many other things. So that's it for this video. Up next, we're going to work on GitHub Actions to make this an automated deployment process to Azure. In the meantime, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.